The big story, unfortunately, the big story heading into last night's game was the Jason Spezza scratch. We had our thoughts on it. If anyone missed that, of course, you can download yesterday's show on podcast, Leafs Lunch. You wrote an article about it saying that the emotions of the Jason Spezza scratch shouldn't linger for Maple Leafs. What was your take on that?
Well, I decided to dig into it because I could tell from the morning skate yesterday, and I was there, how people were reacting in a hurry. And listen, I'm not here to judge other people's reactions and takes. I mean, everyone's allowed to have their opinion. But I think the one element that is most important, I think, to make a point on, and I made it in my column, is that I don't buy for 1 second that this was Mike Babcock trying to show up Kyle Dubas. I don't buy that. Now, I'm not saying that that's not a relationship worth monitoring throughout this season and that it won't be a major narrative. I agree with that. But in this particular case, what I was made to understand yesterday after making a few calls is that Mike Babcock was a major reason why Jason Spezza signed in Toronto to begin with. Like this wasn't Kyle Dubas dumping Jason Spezza on Mike Babcock. Mike Babcock, during a 3-hour meeting a couple of days before July 1st with Jason Spezza and Kyle Dubas also in the room at the Leafs offices, Mike Babcock was the one who spoke the most, is what I'm told, and laid out and mapped out to Jason Spezza why they wanted him and where he'd fit. My point here is this. Clearly, something's happened between then and now that Mike Babcock is trying to light a fire under Jason Spezza. But I don't think it's accurate to suggest that this was the Leafs head coach taking a Dubas guy and saying, I'm not playing him. I just don't buy it in this case.
Yeah, and that definitely wasn't my argument yesterday. And, even Craig and I were bringing it up. Like, it was just more of a respect thing. The more I thought about it, the more it also bothered me, Dregs, was because when I look at the history of the fan base here, and having done a ton of events, and even when, the time that I worked at Leafs TV and we did our shows at the ACC, so I had a chance to speak to a lot of fans. A question they had, back in, the last few decades was, why don't homegrown kids want to play? Like guys from Toronto, why don't they want to play for the Toronto Maple Leafs? Why don't they want to come here? Why don't they want to maybe, even if it's like the end of their career, just come play here, retire? And obviously the first answer was, well, the Leafs aren't good enough, right? They really weren't. At the end of the day, the team wasn't good. Yeah. Why would anyone want to come? But now the team is good. And 2 years in a row, homegrown kid has come to this team. And John Tavares. Yeah. And then now Jason Spezza. And then I kind of feel like, well, what message does that send, too?
Yeah, I mean, optically
That's the history of of what the fan base has had to, deal with, too.
Yeah, but, I mean, you're talking about players in different edges of the spectrum here, obviously. Jason Spezza is at the end of his game. And otherwise, he wouldn't have signed with Toronto. And I don't have any doubt in my mind that he could have gotten more from a financial perspective elsewhere. So he, with family in mind, made the choice to sign with the Toronto Maple Leafs. I don't question the motive behind Mike Babcock doing this. It's his team. He's the coach. He makes the final decision. What I don't like, what stinks about this is pretty obvious, and that's just the optics of it all. Nobody would have raised an eyebrow if Nick Shore had sat out in Game 1 and Jason Spezza sits out against Columbus in Game 2. It might have been a topic of conversation that we have, but it would have been fleeting. Yeah. So the critics of Mike Babcock, and I talked to a couple of them on my way in today, who are both critical but supportive because, look, you have to respect his resume and his history in the sport, period. But both individuals said, look, why does he always have to make it about him? Mm-hmm. And that's how this one played out a little bit. But guess what? You think Babcock gives a rat's you-know-what about what we think, what the general population, the fan base, anyone around the league thinks? He doesn't. What he cares most about is the outcome of last night's game. Mm-hmm. And that's one more win closer to the playoffs and one more win closer to his Stanley Cup.
8 minutes, 33 seconds, Nick Shore.
And Nick Shore, I thought, had a decent game last year on that last night on that fourth line. And, to Dregs' point, that's why I led my column the way I did last night on the Spezza column, which is that everyone should remember something about Mike Babcock. He took out hockey's all-time winningest goalie out of the net in the middle of a home Olympics and subbed him in with Roberto Luongo and didn't bat an eye while doing it.
Yeah.
Like, you got to understand that Mike Babcock has always had the willingness to make decisions that were unpopular if he thought it would help his team win a game. Now, I'm not convinced that whether Spezza or Nick Shore in the lineup last night would have had any kind of impact on whether the Leafs were going to win or not. And sentimentally, I wanted Jason Spezza to play because he's been this stand-up guy who would have had his family at the game, and it would have been a nice moment to be introduced and all that. I mean, that's why, I was disappointed. But don't think for a second that Mike, like I said in my piece, Freddie Anderson went back to Anaheim after being traded to Toronto and didn't get to play against them. But Mike Babcock's not into these narratives. It's just not his thing.
Well, I'll tell you what narrative I'm into, and this is what I have no problem. He's the coach; he can make whatever decision he wants. That's fine. But I would have respected the decision. I wouldn't have been any less disappointed in his decision, but I would have respected if he would have said, you know what, this is the lineup I'm playing tonight, and I feel more comfortable with Nick Shore in the lineup, rather than the gobbledygook about the penalty killing. Because that, to me, was unacceptable, and I'm not buying it.